mode.
Good afternoon and welcome to CAD-1 and BD Mackey's joint presentation, Rendering in Revit. My name is Stan Henney. I'm the Business Development Manager here at CAD-1, and I have with me today Brian Mackey, founder and president of BD Mackey Consulting, a noted Revit firm, Revit consulting firm. And if you're looking for great consulting help on Revit projects, Revit learning, whatever it may be, well, either one of us can help you with the learning, but Brian's a great guy to go to if you got consulting on projects or details or whatever. So most of you know Brian by now, but anyway, Brian, forgive me, I've got a little bit of a tickle cough, so if I'm wheezing and coughing, I hope I don't bug anybody too much. Here's our usual screen for GoToMeeting. Hopefully you can all hear us, and the mic and speaker's telephone thing isn't a question. If you can't hear that anyway. Minimize the console so you can see the whole screen. Hit the orange and white arrow. If you want to raise your hand, you can raise your hand. In fact, what I always like to do is, could you raise your hand if you can hear us, just to make sure that most of you are hearing us out there. It looks like quite a few of you are, so that's good to know. And most importantly, if you want to ask questions during the presentation, you may do so by typing them into the question box, and we will do our best to get them answered in context as well as possible, and certainly by the end of the presentation. So with that, let me go over a couple of housekeeping things just so people are aware. We're really kind of got an awareness campaign going on here to try and make people understand what will be happening in the next few weeks and months. First off, you're going to start hearing rumors of the 2015 software coming out. We don't have exact dates yet, other than we know that it will be somewhere around the 1st of April. Don't know the sequence, don't know the dates of individual product releases and so forth at this point. Autodesk is playing that pretty close to the vest. So with that, we'll go from there. Second, subscription pricing will increase on some products, not all products, but some products, March 28th. It's not a huge increase, but it is an increase, and money's money. So if you do have subscriptions coming up between now and March 28th, or if you do have subscriptions that come due anytime 90 days after March 28th, please contact us here at CAD-1. Get those renewed before March 28th, and so that we can give you the old price. The last thing I want to bring up is, as of February 1st next year, Autodesk will no longer be doing upgrades of older products. So if you have a 2011 building design suite, or something like that, you won't be able to upgrade it after February, or after actually January 31st of next year. So please, if you have this valuable product, I mean, it costs a lot of money, get it upgraded. Let us help you upgrade it. Let us help you find the best way to move that forward, and get it on subscription so that your asset there is protected, and we can help you more with that later. We will try and get your questions answered here. Garfield, I see you have a question. We'll try and get that answered. But let's see if we answer it in the context of what we're doing here. And so, Brian, do you want to go ahead and just light it up?
Yeah, so a few topics we're going to be talking about, and not necessarily in this order. We're going to be getting into the rendering basics. And part of the rendering basics, and the biggest thing about any rendering, is going to be light sources. How can we deal with the light sources? What are good ways to deal with that? How can we make those light sources real by using IES files inside those light sources? And this is kind of one of the big ones, in my opinion, when I start getting into it, because I see so many times people say, oh, these lights just aren't that great, they don't really work. So I'm going to definitely get into the IES lighting on light fixtures. And then we'll jump a little bit into materials, making sure materials are assigned, people are mapping to the right location. And then we're going to talk about the cloud-based rendering. It's where I do a ton of rendering, and yes, it can cost, but it also cannot cost. So we'll get into that just a little bit. And with that, I'm going to jump right onto Revit, unless you had anything else, Dan.
No, let's go. Let's get started, because I know this is going to be a jam-packed hour here.
All right. So one thing I always talk about is I always hear people saying, you know, I go into program X to do my rendering because Revit just really isn't capable of doing rendering. I would completely disagree with that. It's just the fact that there are other programs that might do it easier in your mind, but if it's a program that you already have and what you're familiar with, go ahead, export out to those utilities, those programs, and use it. The one thing that I always like to say that I learned how to do rendering in Revit is because as the design changes, the renderings are going to match the design. So many times I see somebody say, okay, we're going to export this to program X, and then they spend half a day getting program X materials mapped, or this done, or that done, or whatever else that may be. And in that half-a-day process of mapping those materials, doing something else, the design changed, and now when they finally get to hit the render button, the model has changed it, and it doesn't necessarily match. So for me, it's a lot of getting into it. I know people like 3ds Max, and there is a workflow to go out to 3ds Max. I know people like Maxwell Render, which has an add-in to bring the model into Maxwell. You've got all of those options. For me, I'm just talking about the in-the-box Revit rendering as well as just simply using the Autodesk Cloud rendering. So it's one thing I want to talk about. And I did bring up an example of Steve Shell. I don't know if anybody's ever seen any of his presentations. I know the Revit Kid also, you can check out his blog. The Revit Kid also has some timely things. But Steve Shell actually used to be a lighting person for stages. And so for him, rendering is great. He spends a lot of time on his lighting. And when you really start getting into some of this, this is natively rendered inside of Revit World. So it might not be one of these, 100% what you need, but this is what he's modeled in Revit. He went through and just hit the render button and then was able to go through and do this. So Steve's based out of Arizona, for those of you who don't know who he is. And you can kind of get in here and start seeing, he's an architect by trade. He teaches at Autodesk University, Revit technology conferences. He likes to share his knowledge. But as you can kind of see, he's got into this and just taking those images and rendering directly inside of Revit. Doesn't go out looking like some pretty good images in a lot of these locations. He does some of this by using background images when he's doing some renderings. He'll use some what are called decals. So I know for him, like if he's doing a sign and he's got a specific sign for a client that needs rendered, he might put a Revit decal on and render that decal. So depending on what he's doing, these are some of the things you're getting in and doing. And even to a scenario like this, he's got a background image that he uses for the background to show a lightning bolt in a nuclear haze. I'm not sure what that's supposed to be, but just really trying to get into some of these background images. So all of this is capable of happening inside of Revit when you start getting into it and seeing what's going to happen. I believe this was a finished photograph of a project, but some of the stuff you get into, you'll see that he's doing a lot of the renderings inside of the Revit world. That one also, I believe, is a finished photograph. So it's what he does, and you'll also see BIM After Dark by the Revit Kid. He's got some great samples as well. So if you want to get in there, a couple just websites for you guys to look at and really start getting into to see, hey, wow, you truly can get into some of these renderings in Revit. So here'd be another version of that as well. So just always like to point that out. Yes, it absolutely can happen. So we'll start jumping into some of that. So I'm going to use this residential home that was I'm kindly allowed to use from one of my clients, Kruger Design and Construction. So we're going to use his little building. He does residential homes, but it's a nice little file that I like to come in and start talking about when we get into here. So there's a couple different scenarios when you are rendering on Revit, a couple different choices that you have. When I go to the View tab, we're going to have two options in here. We're going to have render and we're going to have render in the cloud. So the difference is if you're hitting render on your machine, you're using your machine's power and processes to go through and do the rendering. So if you've got a machine with 12 cores and 128 gigs of memory and a 6 gig, 8 gig video card, your rendering is going to go much faster than mine.
And so, lucky you.
And lucky you. So obviously, depending on what you have for a machine, it's going to go faster. However, if we all decide to go use the render in cloud, what is nice about the render in cloud is it's using the same, I would say Autodesk servers, but I believe they rent them from Amazon. So the same tools, the Amazon processes, to go through and start getting your renderings done. Now, as you do renderings in the cloud, depending on your settings, it is going to cost you cloud points. So what that actually means in the Autodesk world is for every suite, every building design suite premium you have, you get 100 cloud points.
That's right.
It depends on if you just have Revit. I don't think it's 100. If you have Building Design Suite Ultimate, I think it's like 120. I don't remember, but Autodesk gives you cloud credits or cloud points for the different design of for the different programs you own.
That's right.
You can also buy additional Autodesk cloud credits for $1 a point with a minimum of, or in 100 block increments. So you can buy 100 points for $100, so just depending on what you're looking at there. Now, there are some advantages of doing this on the cloud. One of the advantages are in the cloud, they have a panoramic rendering where I can go drop a camera in a room and get a 360-degree view of that room. You just drop the camera, you look one direction, you tell it to go render in the cloud, and when you go access that in the cloud, you can go in there and spin and look up, look down, look all around you. You get a 360-degree rendering of that room. Can't do that natively in Revit, so it's a great feature to have if that's something that you're looking for. The other thing about rendering in the cloud is that's what's really nice about it is A, it's fast, but B, when I'm rendering in the cloud, it doesn't take down all the processes of my computer. So I'm going to go do a very quick little rendering in Revit, and I'm going to open up my task manager, and you'll see that all of my little bars are going to be pretty much maxed out in Revit as I'm going through and working because I'm using 100% of my processing power. I can speed things up, I can slow things down. I still work on other products like Office, Exchange, Outlook, whatever, but it is going to be pretty much hounding my system. If you render to the cloud, you know, you can still go about your business as you see fit. So just kind of some of the differences there. There are two options when rendering to the cloud. One of the options are use my settings. So if I went through and said, I want to be using my settings for light bouncing, etc., it'll use your settings, or there's what they call, I think, advanced, which it just uses the predetermined settings in the cloud. I have seen different renderings come from each, and sometimes I like the one on my machine better than I like the ones on the cloud, and sometimes I think the cloud ones are better than the ones on my machine. So it just depends what's going on with your file.
One of the things that we learned recently here is that, you know, when you're using, every processor handles things a little bit differently. So one of the slight drawbacks, it's not a huge drawback, but it is a drawback at times of using the cloud, is that the Amazon servers or the servers that Autodesk uses wherever they are kind of interpret things a little bit differently at times. So you get some variables in your rendering and you go, why did it do that? There are ways, and Brian, maybe you'll address these, there are ways to make sure that you're not spending your cloud points till you're ready to do a finished rendering by kind of posting some trial renderings to make sure that things get done. The cloud is a interesting tool. It's a very good one, but there's a little bit of trickery to it too.
Yep. So a couple things that I always like to point out first before rendering, especially if I'm doing an exterior rendering, but I also do it on interior renderings because it's going to affect shadows and where the sun position is. So a couple things for me that I always get into when I start doing, and I think this is one that a lot of people miss. On the Manage tab, I'm going to go into my location. Because even though you might have went into your project address and typed in your project address, that does not set the location up in the Revit world. So when I come in here to location, I can just type my address in, and then Revit is going to drop that address right where it needs to go. So hey, here's the address of this project. So I can come down here, here's the address of this project, and if it's off slightly, you can take the little pin and move it wherever you want to. So that's going to put it in the correct location for where the sun is going to be. I just think this is one of the most overlooked things I see when people start getting into this, is the fact that they just go into Revit, they type in the project address under project information, but they don't go define the location inside of Revit. So then they start rendering and like, man, what's going on? Why is it so sunny all the time? Or why is it this? Well, the default out-of-the-box template, your location is Boston, Massachusetts, because that's where close to where the Autodesk programming facility is for Revit. So that's going to be your default location. So if you're down in sunny Florida or something, you might be wondering, man, why am I getting the shadows more intense in the winter than I would expect? It's also funny that I have noticed that if you go put yourself like really far north, like Anchorage, Alaska, and you do it during the winter or summer solstice, yeah, it completely freaks Revit out. It doesn't understand how to deal with 23 hours of sun or 23 hours of dark. So just thought I'd let you guys know that if we have anybody listening from way up north, anywhere north, I have seen Revit have issues with rendering internally. I don't know if I've tried that on the cloud rendering.
Or anyone working on the
or way south
McMurdo team in Antarctica that
yes.
We've been helping out a little bit lately.
Yeah, so you might have some issues if you're way north or way south. I've never tried way south. So the other thing that I always like to talk about that I don't think a lot of people pick up on is true north. So in this case, this building, that pretty much is true north here. But notice how when we're looking at my compass here, the compass isn't perfectly in line with the north, east, southwest. Obviously, it's saying top, and normally in a file, top is parallel to north. So we went through and set up the true north in your project. So those are the two things that I think that people miss, is they're like, well, I'm doing this rendering, and the sun's not coming in the south side. It's coming in the north side, or it's coming in the west side, and that could be because your true north isn't set up. So what you can see on here is this building has been rotated so we can fit it on sheets, but truly north is going to be that, it's going to be that direction. So north is up here, and this is where that building sits. So we did set true north up on this building for project orientation. So I think that's something else you really need to look into. Set the true north up, set the project location up before you start doing anything. And that's going to make a big deal when you start getting into these things. Okay, the last housekeeping thing I like to talk about is if you start getting into using custom materials. So I'm going to go download a material from the carpet manufacturer or manufacturer X, or I just went and took a really cool picture with my cell phone, and I'm going to use that cell phone as the JPEG image for this. If you're in a multi-user environment, the biggest thing is most people have Revit pointing to the C drive for rendering materials. So when I go generate a custom material, I put it on my C drive and I hit render and it works great. But then when Stan goes and renders, his C drive is not the same as my C drive, and he goes and renders, and all these materials look completely hosed. So that's one of the other things for me, and I personally do this in the deployments if I'm in a multi-person firm. But if it hasn't been done in your deployment, the big thing you need to go into is go into your application menu, and that's the big purple R, or sorry, 2014, the big blue R, and come down here into your options, and in your options you have this rendering path. So when you grab the rendering path inside of here, one of the places to start looking at for additional appearance paths is you can add it inside of here. So you come up here and say, hey, we're going to go look for this path on our server. So on your server, for most of my clients, I set up on their project folder or wherever their Revit content is, just a Revit rendering or Revit materials path. And that's where we're going to save all custom materials, all custom JPEGs, etc. So that way, if I go render and then Stan goes and renders the next day because I'm sick, we're both pointing to the same thing where any of those materials have been set up. So any custom JPEG, any custom bump map that you're going to be doing, any of that stuff, everybody should be writing to the same location. Some of my clients put project folders underneath that location because Revit will go into the subfolders to look for it. Personally, for me, I then see this people creating pretty much the same material over and over. So I like not project folders, but possibly material type folders, or just dump it underneath there, depending on how custom and how many of these you're going to get. So that's kind of one of the things for me when we're talking about that is where really are you going to be going and what's going to be happening for that rendering. So just go into your rendering tab and add a location. Again, that can be set up in your INI file before Revit's deployed if that's something you guys are looking at. Okay? So with that said, the biggest mistake I see when people, even if they've got that set up, is I see a lot of people trying to render from the orthogonal Revit view. That's not something Revit truly likes to do. Revit really wants to be rendering from a camera. So when you start doing a rendering, you're going to probably go in and place a camera down first. So I'll go into a floor plan, I'll go somewhere, it doesn't really matter to me where you go, and you'll go grab your camera on the View tab. It's under the 3D drop-down. And say, hey, I'm going to place a camera. So even if it's an outside view, even if you want to do a direct elevation rendering, you're still going to be using a camera. Now this is also another little tip that I talk about. A lot of people say I want to render my elevation, but I don't want that in perspective. I want it to look just like my construction document elevation. Well, I'm going to step back here. If I go into a building elevation and I go look at it, you will notice that the rendering icon is not available. It's grayed out. So inside of Revit, you cannot render a flat view. It has to be a camera view. So if you wanted to render this elevation, you can't just go ahead and hit render in an elevation. However, what you can do is when you are placing a camera, you can choose, is that camera a perspective view or is that camera going to be a straight-on view? If I uncheck perspective, I can now do a camera as a straight-on view. So this will look very similar to what's going on with my standard elevation view. So this is one of the other big things for me when I'm talking to people like, oh, I just want to go render an elevation. Great. Just set it up as a non-perspective camera view. And I think that's a big one that when I tell people like, oh, I had no clue. It works just like any other camera view except for It gives you the target elevation and the eye elevation at the same height, so that way you're not looking up or looking down. It gives you the depth for how far back do you want to be looking, or you can also turn the far clip active off so you're looking all the way through the entire model. So you do have that same depth range, you have that same information, etc. And yes, you still have your same crop region to be able to go pull this in and drop this around. So if this is a view I truly just wanted to go render, I can adjust this, get it where I needed to go, and now go render to the cloud, etc., etc. Okay, so that's one way to do non-perspective rendering. You also have the capability to go place a camera view and do renderings from a camera view. So this is a camera view I've placed in the nice little lobby here, or not lobby, in the nice little front door foyer looking through the building here. And it's just setting up a camera view. Now, one thing for me when I'm doing these camera views and getting this set up is I use the steering wheel command a lot. I don't see a lot of people using the steering wheel command because the steering wheel command isn't necessarily that great. But for me, I'll access the steering wheel command with cameras because I can just grab the look up, look down command. I can grab the pan. A lot of times people are like, oh, I just want to shift the camera to the right a little bit. How do I find that camera on floor plan to move it around? Well, I can use the pan, and this is truly just moving the camera around in that view. I can use the walk tool and start walking forward to place this camera truly where I want it to be. So I can like, oops, that was a little bit fast, and walk up to here. I don't think I needed to walk into the closet, but I can walk to here and then look sideways, and I can really start changing the look of my view depending on what I want to be looking at. The key thing I'll point out is when you are moving the camera this way, I do usually go back into plan view to make sure I'm not inside of something. I had one person struggling dramatically with renderings, and then we realized that furniture was, our light fixtures were turned off in plan, and they put the camera directly inside of the lamp. And they spent hours trying to figure out where was this really bright yellow haze in all of their renderings no matter what they did, and we found out the camera was inside of the lamp, which had a yellow shade on it. So it was just kind of funny because we didn't see that in plan. It took me a while to figure it out too. So when you're going through and doing that, the steering wheel, really beneficial to see what's going on. Now, as I said, sometimes I like to go back and then adjust, hey, did I screw that camera up too bad? And people a lot of times ask me, well, how do I find that camera view again? So finding camera view is if you find that 3D view in the project browser and right-click on it, and this is true of any 3D view, you can hit the little third drop down here, or the third option that says Show Camera. And that's going to show me, unless cameras have been turned off, try that again. Okay, I might not be looking down far enough. I thought that was on the first floor. Maybe it's on the second floor. Let's try that again. Right-click, Show Camera. There we go. So you can see my straight-on camera. It's showing me here. Yeah, cameras must be turned off or something. So here's my straight-on camera. It's looking this direction, and it's looking back that far. So depending on any camera view you do, including the 3D views, you can always say Show Camera to kind of see where it's going. And I must have some issues going on here because I am not seeing the cameras. And I did not think a camera was, it's not a category. I'll have to look into that one. I was seeing this yesterday, so I don't know what I broke in the file since yesterday. But going back, checking, seeing where that camera is, displaying where it's going to be, making sure it's not in an object becomes kind of big as well. Yeah, good call. Somebody said it could have been outside my crop region. But I thought I was inside the building on this one, so that's where I'm confused. So with that said, that's how you can get set up for a camera. So the other thing that you're going to need to be looking at are your materials. So if I go to my Manage tab, I'm going to have this nice materials dialog. I am doing this in 2014, so I'm going to have the finally decent back to the old 2014 material rendering here. So these are all the materials that are being used in the project. And I think one of the things that a lot of people screw up with is they come to a material like, let's say, hey, we're looking at that wood floor. Let's see what that wood floor material is to start with. Come on. All right, we'll look at this wood trim. I'm going to go see what material it is. The material, is there a material property for this? Was it instance-based and I just missed it? Okay, so this one's got material being defined in the family. So we'll grab something I know where the material is not being defined in. I'm trying to get the floor here. All right, we'll go back to a 3D view. It's probably wood plank. But when you go to your material objects here and you start looking at them, one of the things to really start looking into on this is what's the rendering going to be doing? So you can set up shading here, etc., but the big thing you want to do is going to the Appearance library. So this Appearance tab is really where it's going to be start coming in saying this is the render material I'm going to be using. Now, depending on what type of asset you have for the rendering, it can start using different options. So like this one is based on wood. Wood can have relief patterns, wood can be tinted, and here's all the information that can start coming with the wood as well when you're looking into it. So depending on if you choose this is a wood asset, this is a glass asset, this is this type metal asset, you're going to have different options when you come in to start tweaking and customizing this material. So with most of the materials, I shouldn't say all, you have what image am I going to be getting for like the grain on this wood? What image am I going to be getting for et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? So it depends on what you come in here. You can start seeing all of these different materials or possibly the same material and then stain colors for these. So what color am I going to stain it? So even though I'm saying use this green, I might want to go in and make it a bluish tint to that so I have this nice blue stained wood. And you can see it'll update in the nice little preview up there. So you can change the stain color, and this is going to be mostly used for the graining or the bump type scenarios that's going on inside there.
And as Brian says, always says, he's not a designer.
Oh, come on, you don't like purple wash or blue wash or whatever that's going to be?
Actually, it's kind of nice.
So with that said, if you really want to start getting the depth and the texture to this, and I'm not going to cover this because we don't do this in Revit, you can do this in Photoshop and other programs, but you can create what's going to be called a bump pattern. So you can also have an image that's a reverse of the image where basically it's just going to be black and white, and you can then start choosing different relief patterns as well. So if I'm going to start getting into something like, this wood grain, I really want to have heavy texture wood grain, or in Revit I put stone, but I really want to get some depth into that stone, etc., I'm going to come through and start changing and making sure I'm using a bump pattern. So if I say based on wood grain, Revit's going to use that and do a black and white image of that. If I come back and say, no, I've got my own custom image, I can then go browse for one of these file types to give me that bump map that I'm going to be looking for. Okay, so that's really where you're going to start going through and setting that up when you need to. Also, if you then wanted to add a tint to my bluish color, I could then say, ooh, let's do a bluish color, but I really wanted to tint it, slightly orange. So make it a really slight shade of orange, and we'll say, okay, so I've got a blue with an orange tint. So yeah, like I always say, I'm not a designer, right? But that's how you can start going through and playing with some of this information as you get into it. If you start grabbing something else like glass, and I'm just going to come down here and grab like generic glass. Glass, you're going to see, has different properties in the materials that you can go start tweaking with. Well, it's got glazing and it's got tint. The thing that's honestly weird about the glazing is the sheets of glass is how it's going to be more transparent or less transparent. And the other thing about this is it does not look at sheets of glass if you're going to use the cloud rendering for daylighting. It looks at the color. So I know there's a bug right now on the daylighting where it doesn't care how many sheets of glass you have. It's truly looking for color. And I've also seen some issues in that when you're getting into rendering in and of itself. I'll go put 3 panes of glass and all of a sudden they become more clear. It's really bizarre. Some of the times the rendering. So when you're looking with glazing, you can play with the number of panels, the tint on it if you want to tint it, how much is the reflectance for bouncing of light, etc. So a lot of this stuff's going to have different options when you start coming into it and start looking at it. You start grabbing a material that's based on fabric, you've got cutouts, you've got self-illumination, you've got bump maps, you've got the tinting, you've got transparency, how reflective is it. And all of this is going to take time getting that set up, getting those materials set up. It's not just, hey, let's grab a JPEG image and go to town. It's going to really be getting into setup of what are we truly starting to look for when we get inside of this. If you go grab paint, it's going to be, here's my paint for interiors, it's wall paint, it's got a finish of gloss, or does it, is it eggshell, it tries to pick up on the types you can get, and how was it applied, is it a brush, a roller, or spray, it's going to help with the reflectancy, etc. So again, play with the different material types to kind of see what options you have inside of there. When I grab that one like fabric, and a lot of the metals will be the same way, you'll have relief patterns, so you can go grab a stainless steel anodized aluminum, but then I can say, hey, there's going to be cutouts in this, so maybe you're doing, some sort of square cutout in it. It'll actually use that and allow light to pass through it. So in the Revit world, I'm not modeling a chain link fence. I'm not modeling a steel grate. I'm just going to put a metal material that has cutouts in it. That will let me start going through and getting what I needed to do in there. So all the different options when you start coming through and looking at this. The other thing on this too is if you're trying to change these and really want to see what's going on, you're getting a little rendered image above. You saw glass wasn't on a sphere, it was on something else. You can change different ways of looking at the preview. You can change different scenes on how it's going to be looking. You can even also change, I'm going to go back to the sphere, you can even also change the quality of the preview. So I know a lot of people come in here and say, man, Revit's really slow when I open up the material dialog. Well, half the time I see it's because people have this on like a fine quality. So Revit's taking longer to change this preview when I jump from one material to the next, and that does slow it down. So just a little note there, you can start seeing what's going on, et cetera, et cetera.
And things like that will slow your models down too.
Yep.
They're applied.
So that's kind of one of the big things. Again, there's so many different arts on just materials themselves. I'm not going to jump too much into that. I really just want to start talking about, let's get into the Revit objects. Well, now let's get into lighting. So if you have lights modeled in Revit, and there is a light source to that light, Revit is going to use that object's light source. So if this object truly has a light source, Revit's going to see what's going on. And a lot of times for me, you're going to see that I'll be in a little realistic mode here, but the realistic mode is not picking up on lighting. Realistic is picking up on material renders, so the little JPEGs, but it's not picking up on lighting. If you really want to pick up on lighting, you can hit the little ray trace button, and Revit is then theoretically going to go through and try to start figuring out how the light's bouncing around. So this is one of my quick ways before I go spend a ton of time hitting the render button. Let me just hit the ray trace, wait a minute or two depending on the complication of your view, and see what's going on inside of there. So you can see the ray trace on my laptop. My laptop's not, it's about 3-4 years old now. It's not the fastest laptop ever, but it will take a while. I know Autodesk talks about, oh, look, you can work interactively in the ray trace, and you can move, and you can spin, and yeah, each view is taking this long. It's not working too well for me. You can see it's still going. I'm just going to go back to realistic. Okay, so it will be using these light sources. Now, this is a key thing for me that when I start talking about light sources, what's going on. I'm going to go to an RCP on this, just so we can see more than the one light source. When I pick on a light source and I hit Edit Type, Revit has the capability, not all families have this, to have the idea to be able to have a photometric web. So it's going to tell you the light source definition in the family. If it says photometric web, what that means is it's using an IES file to figure out how the light is being broadcast from this fixture. So IES files are what a lot of manufacturers, they go through this crazy process to figure out and run it through a computer. This is exactly how the light is working. This is exactly how the light's broadcasting, et cetera, et cetera. So the other thing when I'm looking at that is I'm not only looking to see if it says photometric web, and I thought I had one that wasn't. That's a bath fan and a light. Maybe that was the one I was thinking of. Yeah, this one wasn't even a light fixture. So this one, the family was created as a bath fan and light, but it truly doesn't have a light source. So in that case, we're not going to be rendering with a light. But it's not going to help me show you what I was trying to show you anyway, so give me 1 second. I know one of these wasn't. Yeah, so if I grab a light source like this one, and there's no IES file, it doesn't give me this little property that was on the other one saying photometric web. Okay? The reason I'm talking about this is when they first introduced the new rendering back in, I think it was 2009 or 10 with Revit, I kept doing all these renderings, and my can lights would broadcast light, but the can light itself would not light up. I did a camera looking directly into the can light, and it looked completely black. What I figured out was when I hit the Edit Type button, they did not have a photometric web. Once I started assigning a photometric web factor to this, a photometric web file to this, it started glowing the light source. And that was kind of one of the big eye-openers to me why I used to think Revit lighting stinks. And the sad part is most of the out-of-the-box content does not use the IES files. They're not set up to do it. Okay? So you can then choose what IES file you're looking at. This is something else I talk to people, that the IES file should also be stored on your server. Because again, this is an external file Revit is going to when it does the rendering to see how is this light being broadcast. And if I have it on my C drive, Stan's not going to be able to see that when it goes and hits the render. Okay? So you can tell by grabbing an object in the family if it has the capability for an IES. But what if an IES file hasn't been defined? So if I grab this little closet light here, not like I'm going to be rendering in the closet, but if I did grab this closet light, you're going to see that it says it has the capability to have an IES file, one more down, but an IES file has not been found. So more than likely what happened is we went to Access Lighting and downloaded this light file. They had an IES being pointed to it, but we didn't go to that manufacturer's website and download their IES file as well. Or if we did, and I know my client did, he had it stored on his server where my machine's not pointing to it. Okay, so this is something else to think about. As you're doing this, you might have an IES file, but you've got to make sure everybody has access to that. Okay, so with that said, I can hit the little browse button, go to the out-of-the-box Revit IES files, and if I knew what the heck all of these mean, I could go through and grab an IES file, right? They're all different. They've got different things, what you're looking for. I'll hit open, and now you'll see it's using that IES file. Most major light manufacturers will have IES files on their server for you to download. When I create custom content, I personally went to Visa Lighting and I downloaded all of their IES files and put them on my server. And now when I do renderings, I'm like, oh, custom light fixture. I'm not sure who the manufacturer is, but let me go grab the Visa light fixture or IES file for a can light. Let me go grab the Visa light fixture for a fluorescent light, for a strip light, whatever it may be. I just go to the Visa website, kind of see what they have, and then use the appropriate IES file.
And in that vein, Brian, Emily asks, if a light fixture does not have the Photometric Web File option, can you add the option? Which
you can, which was the perfect lead-in for where I was going. Good. So this was a little content. I think this was custom created. Again, this client isn't rendering in the bathroom, so I don't think he cared about this object here. But when you start grabbing a Revit family, I don't care if it's out of the box or you started with the Revit template, there's going to be what's called a light source on that family. When you come in here and grab this light source, you're going to see that it has properties for light source definition. When I click on the light source definition, I can make it a point light, I can make it a strip light, I can make it more of a cube light, and then I can make it more of a spherical light. So you can choose what type of shape it's going to be. Then down here, you can start saying, is it broadcasting all around, 360? Is it going to be more like a ceiling mount where it's just broadcasting light down? Or is it going to be more of a point light where it's going to be directed? The fourth option is, oh, no, I actually don't want Revit to determine this. I want the IES file to determine this. So what you do is you click on the Photometric Web File. So you'll see that once I hit OK, this changes to just be this giant sphere going around. Okay? So now I've got this light fixture with a giant sphere going around it. What that did was allowed me in the properties to come down now and choose a Photometric Web File. So again, if I had the IES for my manufacturer, I could come in here, browse to it. I know this is not correct, but you'll just see what's going to happen. I'll choose one, hit the Apply button, and now that's what the light source looks like. So for whatever IES file I stole, this is what it's going to be looking like. Again, I can go back up here and say, well, that's probably not the IES file I was looking for. What if I came down here and grabbed this one? Again, I hit the Apply. You can start to see the different shapes of the lights. Okay, so you can really start coming in here and changing out that IES. Now, the other factor that's weird is once you say Photometric Web, it then starts to give you this tilt angle value, which allows you to change the tilt of the IES file. And I think they did this automatically because every IES file at a 0 angle comes in sideways. I don't know if it's Revit's interpretation of an IES file or what. So pretty much every time you get an IES file, you're probably going to have to change the tilt angle to be 90 degrees. But it's also nice, too, is if you had a light that wasn't just pointing down, but like a wall directional light, you can change that to be 15 degrees, et cetera, et cetera. You also might have to rotate it in plan, but you can start changing the angle of that light to truly get it to do what you want it to do.
Little side note, though, when you'll notice when, let's say you're doing a project coordination and you're in Navisworks and you see all these blobs hanging from the ceiling, well, that's what you're getting.
Yeah, you can actually turn the light sources on, which I'm going to show you in the 3D view to see what they're doing, which also helps you see just in the Revit world, am I seeing what's going on with these light sources? So I'm going to show you that too. Okay, so that's how you can set that up. I load this back into my project. If I was doing a rendering from the bathroom, I could say overwrite, and now this little bathroom light fixture has the appropriate IES file for it. So that's kind of what's nice. If I was truly doing this light fixture, and it was me modeling this, I would model the the globe and the source as a light, and then I would nest it in, and that's how you can get multiple light sources from a single file. So if you've got something like this where you can have 3, 4, 5, 6 light bulbs in it, you just model the one light as just a picture itself, nest it into here, and start mapping those parameters for like IES, etc. And therefore you have the capability to have multiple light sources in a single file, but they have to be nested.
Brian John asks, what is your coding for material? Notice the number like 2233355.
That's personally what this client does. He has them all set up per CSI specs. So 06 is division wood, 05 is concrete, etc., etc. 3 is concrete, 5 is metals, etc., etc. That's what all those numbers were on the materials. Okay, so with that said, one thing I was going to show you guys is if I go into visibility graphics and I come down to lights, light fixtures, notice how there's a light source that has been turned off. If I turn on the light source, you'll be able to see in a couple minutes, is there a light source to that family? So you can kind of see now I've got this, pin cushion looking thing inside of here. So I don't have to grab a family necessarily and look at its properties to see if I have that. If I've got the smooth looking dome, it has a light source. If I don't have the smooth looking dome, it doesn't have a light source. And it's kind of weird because like in a camera, if you select it, it may or may not show up. You might have to zoom in or out to get it to display. But that's how you can go in to see, do I have a light source, an IES definition to that object. Ooh, sorry, I bumped the mouse there. Okay? So that's kind of one of the key things you start looking at. Once you get that done, if you want to do a rendering inside of Revit, we're really going to start going into the not the visibility graphics, excuse me. We're going to be going into the graphic display options and then also the rendering settings. So when we come down here to the rendering settings, this is where we can come in and say, what type of rendering is this going to do? Are we going to do an interior rendering with only artificial light, an interior only sun, an interior sun, and artificial? For the sun settings, what are we going to do inside of there? So you can start setting up, hey, I'm really looking for this time of the year. So you can come in here and set up, gee, I'm really looking for whatever this is. Nope, that's not it. I can just say sunlight from the top right, top left, etc. I can define a given date and time. Right now, it's just set up for lighting, but I can say, give me a still day and give it to me on the summer solstice. Or I can say, no, 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 you what? I want to create a new one, and the new one is going to be today. I can come over here and say, I really wanted this to happen today, and I wanted to see what this was going to look like today at 2 p.m. Okay? So you can come through here and start creating up days. You can set up certain points and times. You can do one rendering with this day, same camera, do another rendering with another day, same day, different time. Whatever you're looking at doing, you can do with this. The other thing you're going to see inside of the sun settings dialog box is if you don't have topography, where do you want to fake in shadows on the ground level? In this view, I can turn that off because I have a floor and I'm on an interior scene. If I've modeled topography on the exterior of my building, I would also turn that off. But if I haven't, I can fake shadows in on whatever level I wanted to. So that talks about the sun settings. Then you can also go tell Revit which light fixtures do you want to be using. So I click on the artificial lights button, it brings me up to the artificial lights, and you can start turning on and off lights that you don't want to be using. And this to me is huge because if I put 100 lights in the basement and I hit render, Revit is calculating the light bouncing on every single one of those fixtures. If I knew I'm not using any of these light fixtures down here, I can simply start unchecking these light fixtures and really start cruising through this object to turn off what I do and do not need to see. Okay? There's also a way to create light groups that you can just turn off the entire group. So you might want to go down and create a basement group or create a bathroom group, a master bedroom group, or a lobby group, a conference room group, an Office 12 group, whatever. You can go through and start creating group lights so you can turn off and on groups as you go through. This is a big one if you're doing it internally on your machine, rendering-wise, that's going to take up speed or not speed. So this is kind of one of the big ones to me that I don't see a lot of people play with. And I'll talk in just a minute about how you're going to be doing dealing with light groups. Okay? And then last but not least, do you want clouds, no clouds? Do you want to use a background image? So I'm going to use a background image. I can go choose an image that I want to be using for this. So if I came in here, said I want to use an image, then I can customize what image I'm going to be using. You could do that on interior scenes where you want to be looking out a window. You could be doing that on exterior scenes, obviously for what's in the background. For me, I'm just going to say go very cloudy. Okay? And then you've got this image exposure that you can start to play with. I'm not an artistic person to know how to change those before I start rendering. So for me, I wait till after I've rendered before I do that. Okay? Now, as for the light groups, if I go back to my reflected ceiling plan, what you'll see is you start grabbing a bunch of lights. I'm going to go to my filter tab and only grab my light fixtures. And when you have lights selected, your options bar gives you the capability to add it to a light group. Okay, this only comes up if only lights are selected. So I can come down here and say I want to go add it to a group. If there was a group here, I could just choose. But now I can say let's create a new group and just call this one living room. I can add another new group and say, hey, we're going to call this one kitchen. All right, we're going to call this one powder, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I can start creating all of these different groups. Go back and select those light fixtures. Oh, I've only got some of them. I hate it when the select previous only gets some of my objects. So grab my light fixtures. So now I can come up here, say what group they're going to be part of. Well, those are all going to be part of the living room. Hey, you want to put all these in the living room? Absolutely, I do. So now all of those lights are in the living room. If I came into this powder room, I could say, hey, grab this light source, make it part of the powder room, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and start working my way through the building, creating those light groups. So therefore, when I go back to start doing this rendering, I can go into my rendering settings, and I can say, now let's really look at the artificial lights, and I don't want to use those living room lights, or I don't want to use the kitchen lights, etc. So this helps you speed up that process of what you do and do not want Revit to be processing lights on. So for me, if I'm doing a lot of rendering, I definitely get into light grouping. So it's kind of one of the things I really do. Downside to that is you cannot group lights through a link, and you can't choose light groups that were created in a link. So if I'm on a commercial project and my MEP engineer went and put all the light fixtures in, Revit's going to use those for rendering, but I can't tell it which ones to use and not to use. So that's kind of one of the drag parts of the file. Okay, so with all that said, I'm going to go hit my render button. Actually, what I can also do is hit the rendering cloud. We'll come back because I'm going to play Emerald on that. I do have a pre-baked view of this. So I'm going to go hit render. And then when you're doing render, you have a couple options. Are you going to do a draft render, low, medium, high, custom, etc.? What are you doing inside of there? One thing I want to point out on this that's kind of cool is somebody had asked earlier, what's the differences between the best and the low and the draft and the medium besides it taking 10 times longer? What's truly going on behind the scenes? If you grab one of these and you hit edit, Revit's going to take you into the dialog box for telling you exactly what it's doing inside of here. So what this is doing is in general option, this is image precision. So how bumpy is the image going to be looking? Reflections and transparency. How many times is it going to calculate that light bouncing off of objects? What are your refractions, etc.? Things that you're used to seeing in most of your programs, these tools are built inside of here. Just medium has been determined as one thing. Draft has been determined as another thing. So if you truly want to start figuring out what's the difference between all of these, you can just look. Hit the edit button under the draft settings and it'll bring this up. If you want to do one of your own, it's like, you know, I really like the settings for bouncing, etc., but I want this to be a little bit better. You can say copy to custom and then change your anti-aliasing to be less bumpy. Change your maximum reflections. If you're in a house of mirrors and you really want to figure out how that light's bouncing around 100 times, maybe it's a special brothel room. I don't know. Once you start doing all of that, you can really start figuring out all of this information, including daylight portals, etc. So if you've been familiar with rendering in other programs, you have all of those options in Revit. They're just kind of varied.
Well, and seeing this, Brian, this is a lot of stuff that you used to only be able to do in 3D Studio Max and not in the Revit rendering. So there is a lot of added capability just in native Revit now that wasn't there even a couple years ago.
Yes, exactly. So with that said, I'm just going to leave the draft. I've already played with the lighting, so you don't have to go down here and play with your rendering settings. That is inside the dialog box when it comes in. And then I can hit the render button. But if you really just quickly need to see, man, what's going on inside of here, rather than rendering the whole view, you can also hit, I want to render just a specific region. Then you can go back on the screen and pick that region. Like, I don't want Revit to really think about the background, how's the light bouncing in the background, through the kitchen, through the window, etc. Just do this real small area right here and let me render that. So once you grab that region dialog, you can then pick the red box and adjust it. So you hit the render. It is going to take up a ton of information on your machine. And what I mean by that is if I go start the task manager and I go into my performance, you're going to pretty much see every single one of my processors get maxed out. So just to do that little rendering, most of my processors are going to start taking off and getting maxed out. You know, one of my clients, they've got dual 6-core machines. They're double threaded, so they have 24 processes, and when you render on those machines, you see all 24 processors pretty much being maxed out. So yes, you still can work, but you're trying to work through the difficulties of this. And this is one of the parts in Revit that truly does get into the scenario of, hey, I'm going to use multi-threading, so use as many processors as I can. So, you know, just by coming in here, I'm looking at this saying, wow, that's a little bit dark. So either my lights are off, or something's going on, or maybe I turned off the wrong artificial lights. I didn't pay attention to what I was doing. I thought I left them all on. I did. But you can also then just come in here and adjust the exposure. So if you need this to get a little bit brighter, you can adjust the exposure without having to leave the render. And this is what I think is kind of cool, is you can play with those exposure settings once you've done this draft rendering to see what's going on inside of here. So you get shadows, your everything going on inside of there. I actually meant to do artificial and sun. So we'll do that again and we'll hit re-render. So that's one thing about the exposure that I love. You can play with the highlights, the shadows, the shading, the colors. You can play with all of that without having to re-render. So it's kind of a nice process on that. The other thing, honestly, that I do because I'm a little OCD is during the rendering dialog box, I uncheck the little close this dialog box when the rendering completes because I want to be able to see how long it took at the end. Because usually it finishes and I blinked and I'm like, hey, wait, how long did that take? So personally for me, I like to see how long this took. I also like to then go down and when I save the image in my project, I like to save it with the time and what draft. Was it a draft? Was it a medium? Was it a custom? Just so when somebody else comes, ooh, how long did that take? I can tell them. And so as you can see, playing with the daylighting and artificial, I think I made it even darker. But you're getting the point of this. Go through, play with your lights, see what's going on. I'm going to actually unturn the region. I'm going to hit the render button with everything inside of it. It could have been the time I chose too. Did I choose 2 p.m. or 2 a.m.? I might have chose 2 a.m. But at any rate. So as this goes through and just renders in my draft mode, the other thing you could have hit is the render in cloud button. And I'm going to come back and talk about that. But if you hit the render in cloud, what it's going to do is go up to Autodesk and use their servers to process this. And I have not had any rendering take more than 4 minutes in any mode. You do it in a draft mode, it takes 4 minutes. You do it in a fine mode, it takes 4 minutes. I mean, it's pretty consistent for me in most of the files I've tried. I haven't went into thousands of files and tried this. I've done it like 10 or 15. But the render times are always like 2 to 3 to 4 minutes. So it's pretty fast what you can do. Plus, for that 4 minutes, you can still continue to work in the Revit model because it's just a once it processes it, it's done, and you can go do it. So with that said, I'm going to go ahead. Oops, that's PowerPoint. That's not what I meant to do. I'm going to go ahead and go down to Chrome. I'm using Chrome on this. And you can kind of see this was just me doing a very basic draft cloud rendering of that same model from that same camera we're looking at. So a lot of times for me, rather than doing a draft in Revit, I'll do a draft off of the cloud to see what's going on. Do my light sources light up? Because if I didn't have an IES, those would be black. Did I get materials assigned to all of my objects? Oh man, I missed the material on this door and this door. And just truly quickly doing this draft rendering, and you'll see this draft rendering of the entire thing took 2 minutes. So my little information there tells me when it was done, how long it took, what's the image size, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, and doing it this way doesn't eat up your cloud points.
And that's the
until
big
you're
thing.
ready to do the final render.
So just a quick rendering like this, as Stan said, 0 cloud points. Draft or standard renderings, as they call them, no cloud points. So just coming in and hitting this, that's all it's going to take. Okay? As you can see, we're over 3 minutes, and this thing, where I don't know if we are yet, now we're over 2 minutes, and my other one would have been done on the draft rendering, and this one is still processing. So a lot of times for me, I'll use that cloud rendering just to see what's going on before I start processing it. I probably screwed up my exposure as I was playing with it.
Emily asks, why does the cloud distort or enlarge custom material images in the cloud, such as wood grain, planks, etc.? Do you know, Brian?
I haven't had that happen to me yet. So my cloud renderings with the few custom materials I've used, I have not had those get distorted.
Emily, what I will say, we were working with one of our clients here, and that a similar issue came up, and I don't know that we have figured it out yet, other than to say that so far what we found is that this is one of those things, as Brian alluded to earlier. If he puts a material on his hard drive and then I put it, say, hey, ooh, I like that, and put it on my hard drive, it looks different at times. And what we've found is that sometimes when materials or other things are uploaded to the cloud, for whatever the reason, they get thrown off a bit, and you have to kind of tweak them and adjust them. Fortunately, it doesn't take too long to produce the rendering, but that's one of the slight drawbacks to the cloud so far.
Yeah,
it doesn't happen often, but it's irritating when it does.
So you guys can kind of see, you're doing this. And yeah, somebody did say it would make sure your Revit is always got the latest service pack, because the cloud rendering is always working off the latest service pack for the Revit models. So if you're like on the original Revit and you're on Web Update 3, if you're in 13 or whatever, it's not going to, you might have issues there too. So point on that one.
Thank you, Riley.
So you can kind of see that's my little quick rendering. So that's my draft rendering in Revit, which took me 2.5 minutes. This is, why do I keep going to PowerPoint instead of Chrome? This is my draft rendering on the cloud that cost me 0 cloud points, took 2 minutes, and just faster, a little bit easier to start seeing when you go through it. Okay, so rendering in the cloud is not going to be that much different. I'm going to go to render in the cloud, and the thing that I think about most of this is when you do the render in the cloud is it is looking at your location. So make sure your location's set up. All those things I told you at the beginning, the location, the true north, et cetera, it's looking at all of that information when you start coming up here and setting this up. I will say that, that's new, estimated wait time. I have noticed that today, the Revit servers or the Autodesk servers are terrible. I didn't think I was going to be able to show you my cloud renderings because it took me like 15 minutes to log on today after Revit Radio. So just thought I'd point out that, yes, again, cloud rendering drawback is if there's a huge queue in their line or whatever, you might be waiting, or if their servers are down, etc. So
amazing that
I've never seen this new estimated wait time. That's new to me.
Brought Amazon to its knees.
So the one thing that's also nice about cloud rendering is you can say I want to do this 3D view and that 3D view. You can do more than one at a time, because what's happening is it's posting your Revit model up to their servers, and it's downloading all the data with the Revit model. So you can say, hey, render these 20 views for me. I don't care. And that's one of the beautiful things of it. So you can just say, hey, go render these 10 views, and done with it. Revit, you're rendering one view at a time. So you can be like, I wonder which one of these is going to look better. I've got these 6 cameras set up. They're slightly different angles of the building. I wonder which one's going to look better. Render all 6 of them at once. Yep. Walk away. So you'll see the output type, is it a still image, is an interactive panorama, and that's what I was saying you can do, so a 360 view. I'm going to leave it for still. Is the render quality standard? Is it final? So standard is there, and then how big is the image going to be? Small, medium, large, extra large, maximum. And what is your exposure going to be? So if I click in here under exposure, advanced, let the server, cloud server, figure out what it's going to be doing for bouncing, etc., or use what you set up in native for all the light bounces, etc. And then if you have a background image, what do you want to be doing with the transparency and the alphas on that background channel? Notice right here it's telling me if I run this, the cloud credits are 0. I have 100 available cloud credits in this account. If I come up here and said, ooh, I wanted to do an interactive panorama, it's retelling me, ooh, just that's going to be 4 cloud points. Well, I want that to be a final interactive panorama. That's going to be 6 points. Ooh, but I don't want a small image. I want an extra large image of this. That's going to max me out at 96 cloud credits. Okay, that's new to me. I have not done an interactive at a maximum. That's a new one to me. So
there's some good stuff. You got 4 cloud credits left to buy your lunch with.
To buy my lunch with. Okay, so just go through and start looking at what you're doing here. It is requirements, and do pay attention to this. I had one client come in, and they had one of their users use their 100 cloud credits up in like an hour because the guy didn't do draft rendering, so he did everything as final. And, oh, crap, I forgot to sign in IES. Oh, crap, I forgot this material. And within an hour, he went through $100 for the points.
Brian, we've got a couple questions here. And I think that I'm not sure how to answer them because I know, some of them will take quite a bit of time. We have a question from Garfield from earlier, which I didn't want to interrupt the flow to get to, and then Emily asked a similar thing. Garfield asked, what is the quickest way to create a brick soldier coursing material? And Emily asked, can you take a few minutes to show us how to set up a custom material? Would like to see it, see if I do it the same. Those are kind of the same questions. Now, I don't know how long that's going to take. We're kind of at our limit right now for the webinar. What do you think? Should we have it again or do a second webinar?
Well, I know, Brian, you're just doing another rendering. I think it's in a month or two, so I think he's going to get more into that stuff, which is why I haven't touched on it.
Okay.
The big thing on that is when you're creating that material is it's what JPEG are you using. So you go grab a brick JPEG, and out of the box, they have brick soldier cores. So most of it is going to be getting into the fact of what JPEG and what bump map are you using for that. Getting those two things lined up. It's not that crazy of a theory to do. It's just really getting, I believe Brian's doing another thing on rendering.
I know he is, yeah.
He uses. So let's wait to see what his does, and if he does cover some of those questions, then we'll come back and we'll do a third follow-up.
Yes, and we'll do some more. Keep an eye out for our webinar notices and sign up for Brian's. We also here at CAD-1, in addition to Mr. Mackey and his services that you can work with if you like, we here at CAD-1, Brian Juge, and both Brian Juge and Michael Calkins have got fairly decent a lot of the rendering tools. We recently contracted with a part-time instructor who will start being 3D Max and cloud rendering classes for us on a kind of a custom basis. They probably won't be right on our schedule immediately for various reasons, but you can call us and set up a class with this gentleman, and he's really pretty good at this if you like. Again, be happy to do additional webinars, and really do want to thank you for your time today.
We're going to continue for a few minutes, but those of you who need to use up your hour, feel free to leave. We won't be offended on that, but we do want to continue with a couple things. So one thing I did want to point out is with the cloud rendering, you'll notice I did the same camera. It overwrites the camera you had if that view has the same name. So that was one thing to me. I had this really rendering. It was actually one I used cloud credits for, and I overwrote it with a draft rendering one day. So just make sure that if you've got a view and it's done, you might want to, possibly delete that view or instantly change the name of that view. It will give you an update of what's happening here. So you can see this image is already done. So the image that I did for that straight-on exterior elevation rendering, that one's done. It's now processing the interior one where there's more light bouncing, et cetera, et cetera. So there is this fun little draft render. I mean, for me, this looks pretty dang good. I might have wanted to throw in a background image or something, but that looks pretty good. And there's also daylighting that you can do on these renderings. So you can go through and say, hey, take this inside and show me how much daylight's coming in. What I also love about this is if I click on this one rendering and get it to come up again, I then have actions of what I can do. Where is it? I thought it was there. Is it a right click? So I've already uploaded this model. I don't even have to have Revit open now. I can come up here and say, oh, you know what? I want to adjust the exposure on this image. That image that's already been rendered, you can adjust the exposure on, just like you saw inside of Revit. And this is one thing I don't know if a lot of people know about. You can still tweak your images up on the server. The other thing on that is I can also right-click on this and say I want to download it, or I want to go back and re-render it as a panoramic. Once I re-render it as a panorama, then it's going to say, ooh, probably not a good idea to do outside because I'm going to see a whole lot of the sky. But if I took that inside one and said re-render as a panorama, it is going to use up my cloud points, but I don't have to resubmit the model. Once the model's been submitted and you've got those cameras set, you can just play with it and tweak it right there in your cloud scenario. So if I'm like, man, that exposure was pretty bright, let me turn it down a little bit. You can start to see how I'm just playing with this right here in the rendered image. I really think we need some more of the highlights on there. So you can kind of see what I'm going through and doing here, that you can really just start to play with. Are the shadows more deep, less deep? What's my saturation? Yeah, like that. But you can kind of see what's going on inside of here, really to do what you want to do. And if you don't like it, the cool part is you can just close it and it doesn't take effect. So that's one of the things I think a lot of people are unaware of on the cloud, is you can right-click and still tweak and play with those images. So with that said, you'll see my interior rendering is done again. Same thing I had before. So there you can go. Again, same scenario, right-click, render as a panoramic. It's going to open this up and say, ooh, what's your settings? And this is how many cloud credits it's going to take you. So one of those things I wanted to point out, you do have it. If you wanted to see some of these other ones, here's my typical training building that I show everybody. You know, I can come in here, and here's, again, all draft renderings. But the key thing I like to show about this one is all of the light sources. Oops, that was sun, this one. All of these light sources were from a linked Revit MEP file. So all of the lighting you see coming in on this are all 100% linked from my mechanical engineer. So I did this one with interior artificial only, so it would be like at night. This is how that space would light up. I didn't even place light fixtures. Again, that came from my mechanical engineer. So I always like to point that out as well, that you can do these, do them pretty quick. All of these are draft renderings. I don't know, for me, just to quickly see how's the space going to feel, what's going to go on. Ooh, why is that room so dark? Did they not get light fixtures in there? A draft rendering that took 3 minutes. Pretty dang nice.
That's pretty cool. That really is.
So, and with that note, I think we got all the questions done except for creating custom materials. But again, hopefully that's something Jude will be covering the next time. I think we're done.
Brian, one thing I want to mention to the audience, this is being recorded, and we will have it posted on our website, CAD-1 website, archives page, and our YouTube page, probably in the next few days. So you can look for that. You can sit through it again if you like. So again, thank you for attending, and Brian, thank you for coming in and doing this for us today.
Oh, it's always my pleasure. And
this is one of the most fun areas, as we all know, as architects and so forth. We love pictures, so this is one of the most fun areas.
Well, and again, I'm going to plug two people out there I know who are passionate about Revit rendering. They don't even know I'm plugging them, but Steve Shell. He's an architect by trade, really pushes us out of there. And then you can also Google the Revit Kid. He's got a whole paid webcast series where he's pretty much only talking about rendering and Revit, and it's called BIM After Dark, Bringing Sexy Back to the BIM Industry. So if you really want to, that's something else you can look at. So thanks, everyone.
As if sexy ever left the BIM industry. All right. Bye, folks.